we bring in our political panel, New Journey PAC CEO Autry Pruitt and talk radio host and civil rights attorney Robert Patillia. Thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen.
Thanks, Scotty.
So glad to be on board, Scotty. Glad to see you again. And Robert, too. I know you. It's been a while, but I know you.
We're like one big family here. It's always a good family. And this is a conversation that I don't see necessarily being a political issue, even though it's made into it. It's about jobs. We should all in this country want people to have a job if they're able to have it. So I'm actually going to start with you, Autry, because you're the first one back on with this. Why do you think black unemployment right now is still on the rise when we're seeing other ethnic groups recovering from the virus?
Because in the areas where blacks mostly are working, which is not high-tech industries such as Google and Apple, it's things like, I don't know, the Keystone Pipeline. Biden is going around on purpose canceling jobs. It's a very simple question with an easy answer. Biden is canceling jobs where black Americans are actually working.
Well, and that's to you, Robert. I mean, is the problem, as you said, the lack of jobs, or is it the lack of applicants qualified and be given the right training for those jobs?
Well, this is the concept of systemic racism at work, and I'm glad that we all can agree on it and that we're all understanding its effects. Let's look at the statistics. African Americans are far more likely to work in those frontline essential worker positions, many of which are being taken over by automation, many of which have been exacerbated by through the course of the pandemic and the subsequent economic slowdowns. Things such as restaurant workers, tipped workers, hourly wage workers have been reduced. If you go to any fast food restaurant now, they have an app, they have a kiosk, reducing the number of in-person employees. So the idea that somehow the Keystone Pipeline is making up for 150 years of systemic racism, I don't think that holds water. What we do have to have is targeted economic stimulus. We need an infrastructure bill that will bring jobs directly to communities. We have to invest in green energy, which is growing at 2 times the rate of employment as the fossil fuel industry is. We have to ensure that we are providing the type of technical and the technology-based education systems where people can have the certifications to have the jobs of the future instead of focusing on the jobs of the past. Things like coal mining and working on oil pipelines, those were great careers in the 19-teens and the 1920s. What we need to be doing is educating a workforce, forgiving college debt, raising the minimum wage, and doing the economic steps necessary to stimulate the economy in the African American community to create parity with other groups.
Okay, but Robert, Audrey, I want you to answer. You just said raising the minimum wage.
Yeah.
A lot of these companies are having to go to automation of robots because they can't afford to have employees because the minimum wage is already they're predicting it will be raised. So to that point, it might not be the Keystone Pipeline, but talk to me, Audrey, about what the effect this is going to have when they do raise the minimum wage on those hourly workers that right now can't hardly get jobs.
Well, the Keystone Pipeline is an example of a systemic problem in terms of bureaucrats in Washington canceling jobs. In terms of a minimum wage, it's not just that's the problem. It's the federal bureaucracy. This is the difference between my friend Robert and I. He says government, through stimulus, should get jobs. And guess what gives jobs? Private businesses give jobs. If you take the restrictions off private businesses, if you get rid of things such as certificate of needs requirements off of private businesses, the economy will be stimulated. Why do I know this? Because we just experienced it for 4 years. This isn't rocket science here. I'm not inventing things. I'm not arguing with you, Robert. I'm just saying the jobs don't need to come from government. They can come from private business. And as far as oil and gas is concerned, this notion that we're going to somehow magically go to green energy and it's going to provide all these jobs is fantasy. Let green energy participate in the free market, and when it catches up, like Tesla, for example, without a government subsidy, when it catches up, it'll compete. I'm not saying don't do green energy. I'm just saying, I don't know, maybe your planes, your trucks, your hamburgers, and everything else that requires, guess what, fossil fuels is where the jobs are. So let people work where the jobs are. Well, that's all I'm saying. And when we get more green, we get more green.
Okay, Robert.
Well, a couple points, and I'm glad that Autry brought up the concept of the Trump tax cuts, which stimulated the economy. That was direct economic stimulus brought to you by the government. It was an unfunded tax cut because we never actually did any austerity or any spending cuts to offset the $1.5 trillion. Indeed, we raised military spending by $1.3 trillion in response. We had a $780 billion defense authorization bill to continue federal spending, which was just a Keynesian economic direct injection of capital into the system, but they injected it at the top of the system. They injected it to the millionaire and the billionaire class to stimulate the economy. That is absolutely no difference than stimulating the bottom of the economy by sending out stimulus checks and increasing the earned income tax credit. Secondarily, on this issue of the Green New Deal, I'm glad you brought up Tesla. The only reason that Tesla progressed as a company was because Barack Obama put in new environmental standards 12 years ago when he got into office, which allowed for green energy companies to get a foothold in taking away some of the subsidies to oil companies. The reason that SpaceX can send rockets into space all the time right now isn't because of the private market, but because they got a $3 billion contract with NASA when they were still on the Falcon 1, which allowed them to develop the Falcon 9 and now the Starship and also the Super Heavy Lifter. So this idea that somehow big business is just lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps is not borne out by any economic model. And in fact, when you have unfettered capitalists in the way of Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, it always leads to serfdom. It always leads to plebiscites. For some reason, we always say, well, if we pay the worker more money, we're going to go out of business. We never say, well, maybe we should just pay the CEO and the board of directors less money and invest that into our workforce so that we can have workers that are more productive and they can have a living wage instead of having the taxpayer subsidize those workers who are making $7.25 an hour as a minimum wage, having the taxpayer subsidize them through welfare and other public benefits, because that's what we're really doing right now. The taxpayers are subsidizing the unfair labor practices and the low employment wages of workers at many of these corporations.
Great conversation. Autry, Robert, we could continue it, but I think in the end we can all agree we need jobs. My question is, what happens is the government's pumping in money right now. What happens when they stop writing those checks?